So we're going on with world history and we're talking about France, and we're on chapter 13, the third section, and we got to the results of the Hundred-Year War. We talked about the Hundred-Year War. Who was the Hundred-Year War between France and England, and who eventually won the Hundred-Year War? We have to say France did. France won the war after 100 years. Can you imagine fighting a country for 100 years? Quite a while. Well, in 1328, the last Capetian king died. Remember, Capetian kings were running. It was the Carolingian lines, which were the Charlemagne line, coming into Hugh Capet, and he developed the first Capetian king. And so in 1328, the last Capetian king of the Louis died in 1328. And then came over the French house of Val-Louis. Val-Louis took the throne. The house of Val-Louis took the throne. So after the Hundred-Year War, we have the consequences of France. What happened to France after the Hundred-Year War? Well, the countryside had been ravaged by all these invading armies of England, and there were a lot of unemployed mercenaries that were hired. England came in and hired a lot of mercenaries to fight the French war, and so did France. France hired mercenaries, so we have a lot of mercenaries that were hired soldiers that were unemployed. And so there was general disorder going on in France after the Hundred-Year War, and as well as England. As the war turned to France's favor, order restored, and France did prosper, and patriotism did develop, but it was very gradual. They had to come out of all the devastation that had been done due to the war. The end of the Hundred-Year War. I like this picture here because look at, you have two really, really old people fighting. The Old English and the Old French, and they're still fighting each other after 100 years. Kind of weird, but anyway. So after the end of the Hundred-Year War, France established an absolute monarchy. That means they had the king, they had the feudal system, and that happened. It was going on, but after the war, the king took over and reigning, and but it ended the aristocracy of the French feudal system. So they had the absolute French monarchy, but not all the little. When I say French feudal system, they had all these little kingdoms, and all these little nobles had kingdoms, and that was, the feudal system. That had disappeared. Now we have just this one French nation altogether. It depleted the ranks of the French nobles, and the king annexed the captured lands, and a standing army was raised, and we have a nation of France now. And eliminated the need for the noble knights anymore. They didn't have all these little noble knights. They actually had one nation of France. France emerged a strong nation. So they had national patriotism. They had no trends towards political freedom as in England, though. Even though they had patriotism, they didn't have all the freedom that they had in England under the Magna Carta, of course. But they did have this patriotism coming as a nation. They did not have limited representative government. They didn't have the parliament. They didn't have the Magna Carta as they did in England. But they were still in the grip of distorted Christianity. They were following Romanism and following the Pope, as England was getting farther away, and France even having its own popes, as I said before. Here we have a picture, and this picture of how the years 1337, before the Battle of Crécy, that's the Battle of the Hundred-Year War, where England won. And so we have this whole control. We have English holdings are the green, and the French holdings. And then we have 1360, after the Battle of Poitiers, we have English holdings. They have Aquitaine and Gascony, and so they have these areas here belonging to France, and we have England here taking over some areas of France, especially Aquitaine. It's a big, wealthy area. And then in 1429, this is during the 100-Year War, we again have England taking over the north area, and we have France taking over Aquitaine again, but we have, see how it's all developed. We have all these different battles going on in the 100-Year War. And then at the end here in 1453, the end of the war, we have France taking just over all of the land that it had before and even more. So we have England, France actually winning the war. The Capetian line, which we went over, we're going to go over these a little bit actually pretty quickly because it's a review. So we had the Capetian line 987 to 1328, and this is Hugh Capet. Then we had Robert the Pious and Henry the First, Philip the First, Louis the Sixth, called Louis the Fat, he must have been fat, and Louis the Seventh, which is Louis the Young. They always have some name, so besides the number. More Capetians. We have Philip Augustus. He's the one we went over, one of the most famous, strongest, and the Philips coming against the Pope. And here's kind of a picture of the Capetian line. Louis the Eighth being considered the Lionheart, and Louis the Ninth considered the Saint. Philip the Third considered the Hardy. Philip the Fourth considered the Fair. That's going to 1314. Louis the 10th, the Stubborn, and then on to John the First. So we have the Louis and the Philips, and now we have John the First. Philip the Fifth was the Tall. Charles the Fourth, the Handsome. These are all French Capetians. So I'm just going over there just to see how their names were during those times. You're going to have to memorize all these, I'm sure. The House of Valois, or Valois, I call Valois. That's how you say Louis. And that's in 1328 to 1515. And these guys were Philip the Sixth, John the Second, considered John the Good, Charles the Fifth, Charles the Sixth, the well-beloved Charles, Charles the Seventh, the victorious Charles, Louis the 11th, 1461 to 1483, so we're getting into the 1500s. Charles the Affable, which is be Charles the 8th. Louis the 12th is 1498 to 1515. So we're in the 1500s, so we're going to stop there, I'm sure, because we're not going to get into the Reformation yet of what happens to all these kings of France. So we're ending there.